Hello, everyone. I want to tell you about a recent survey that we did that is part of a larger research project we are doing on trust in government and confidence in democracy. My name is Naila Rahman. I am the Assistant Director of the Survey Research Center at Princeton University. The survey I'm going to talk about today was originally designed by Rachel Johnson, Brian Lee, Osama Safir, three students from our graduate seminar on survey research methods. Ed Freeland is the instructor for the seminar and is the executive director of the Data-Driven Social Science Initiative at Princeton University. The long gradual decline in trust in government is one of the big stories to come out of American public opinion research over the last 50 years. This decline has happened not only in terms of people's trust in government, it has also happened with many major social institutions in American life, including journalism, mass media, medicine, and big business. This decline in trust in government is also not limited to the United States. It's something that's been happening in many mature democracies around the world. This graph from the Pew Research Center shows the long-term decline in public trust in government as a moving average of many different polls taken over this entire time period. You can see this dropped from a high of 75% in the 1960s to a low of 40% in the early 1980s, fluctuating since then, but falling under 30% since about 2008. So why is this a problem? Well, one has to wonder how low public trust can go until we reach the point where the federal government can no longer function. Lack of trust reduces support for government action and for making compromises on policy, which in turn makes it harder to solve problems. Trust is tied up with an increase in political polarization. As one party becomes more distrustful and less willing to negotiate with the other party, it raises concerns about the long-term prospects for maintaining the health of our democracy. It also raises the possibility that people might become more open to alternatives to democracy, namely authoritarian rule or rule by the military. And there is some evidence in the World Values Survey that this has in fact already begun to happen. From an economic perspective, lack of trust raises transaction costs and makes life more expensive and less efficient for everybody. I should point out that people's perception of government performance is heavily influenced by partisanship. When you break out the line from the previous graph into Democrats and Republicans over time, you see that with each change in the administration, the two lines flips over like a twisting double helix in terms of who is more or less willing to trust the government. But though that may be true, among members of both parties, there is still this troubling long-term secular decline in people's willingness to trust the federal government. So why is this happening? One set of explanations points to cultural factors. A general decline in social capital has resulted in greater isolation among people and alienation from government as it gets larger and more distant from people's daily lives, or at least is perceived as being more distant. Another explanation focuses on government performance. It may simply be that declining trust is associated with people's perception that the government just doesn't function as well as it used to, or that it's not interested in solving the problems that many people feel directly impact their lives. That's certainly been an issue during the COVID-19 pandemic. There is also the impact of political campaigns and advertising that has become more negative over time. It's now more common for politicians to get elected by doing everything they can do to make their opponents look bad. That's very likely had negative spillover effects on our entire political system. The decline of trust in government has happened at the same time as the rise of political partisanship. People are less willing to live near or intermarry with people from the other political party. As trust goes down, willingness for one party or one side to work with another becomes more difficult. There have also been methodological concerns about the validity of what we are measuring when we ask about trust in government. For example, it's not clear what it means for the government to, quote unquote, do what is right. Scholars also have argued about whether trust and mistrust are simply two ends of a continuum or are two conceptually different things. And many studies have sought only to measure the presence or absence of trust and ignored what might be in between. We are going to go in a different direction by breaking trust into a set of constituent elements and seeing which of these elements matter most to people and which are most highly correlated with trust more generally. This is very similar to a new study initiative that was recently launched by the OECD. We focus on four constituent elements of trust. First, whether it's appropriate for the government to be involved in a particularly policy area. First, whether it's appropriate for the government to be involved in a particular policy area. That is, whether they should be trying to solve problems in that area. Second, to what extent do people feel the government is clear and transparent about what it does? Third, does the government have the resources and expertise that it needs to undertake its work in a particular policy area? And fourth, is the government reliable when it comes to the work that it does and accomplishing what it's supposed to do? The survey asks about 5 specific policy areas: regulating banks, protecting people from COVID-19, overseeing immigration, protecting the environment, and maintaining military forces. We ask 5 questions in each of these 5 specific policy areas and 4 constituent elements of trust plus a general measure of trust for each policy area. We also included an online experiment where we asked the Gallup version of the general trust question, namely, how much trust do you have in our federal government in Washington when it comes to handling domestic issues? Half of the sample was randomly selected to get this question at the very beginning of the survey. The other half was presented with the question near the end of the survey, after we had asked about the constituent elements of trust within each policy area. Our hypothesis was that if you ask people to think through the details of what the federal government does, they are going to give you more thoughtful and potentially different responses to the Gallup question. Here is a screenshot from the questionnaire. It shows the agree, disagree items for the 4 constituent elements of trust. Banks need to be regulated by the federal government. The federal government is clear and transparent about how it regulates banks. The federal government has the expertise and resources needed and it is reliable when it comes to regulating banks. And then you see that the 5th question in each series asks about overall trust for regulating banks. And over here on the right, you get a view of what the questions look like on a smartphone. Our survey ran on the CINT National Non-Probability Panel. There was a total of 51 items in the online interview. All of the trust and rating scales ranged from 1 for strongly disagree to 7 for strongly agree, with the neutral point at 4. The survey ran over a 7-day field period. We spread out the responses in order to minimize the impact of competition bias, namely bias that can result from the sampling needs of other surveys that are running on the panel at the same time as yours. We finished with 1,234 initial responses. 66 cases were dropped for no consent, 64 were dropped as partial complete, 16 had low reCAPTCHA scores, indicating they were likely to be bot responses, and finally 19 responses were dropped for speeding, which we defined as any completed response done in less than 2 minutes. The survey included a speeder warning that was triggered about 1/3 of the way through the interview of if a respondent was moving too quickly. The median completion time was 6.5 minutes, and the cost worked out to $2.35 per response. We use the IPF raking procedure from Stata to create a set of raking weights based on the demographic and geographic variables you see listed here. We also included the 2020 presidential vote outcome. We asked people whether they had voted for and for whom they voted in the 2020 election. The weight ranged from a low of 0.102 to a high of 11.6 and was scaled to have a mean value of 1. The median point was the median was 0.63, and you can see that the distribution is pretty skewed to the left. Now the results that you see here for the 5 questions about bank regulation are the point estimates for the mean scores with the 95% confidence interval. And we can see that the scores for the appropriateness of the government's involvement in this area, as well as people's judgment about the government's expertise in this area, both scored significantly higher than judgment about transparency and reliability. So positive scores for the need for the government to regulate banks and the government's expertise in regulating banks, but negative scores for transparency and reliability. And you see that in terms of overall trust, when it comes to bank regulation, that it's most closely related to reliability and transparency. That same pattern we see in the federal government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Respondents agreed that it was important for the government to be involved in responding to COVID-19 and that the federal government has the expertise and resources it needs for that involvement. But here again, transparency and reliability score low along with the measure of overall trust in the government's response to COVID-19. Same pattern for overseeing immigration, very high scores for appropriateness and expertise, low scores for transparency and reliability. Same for protecting environment. And for military forces, which has been among the most highly trusted institutions in the US, very high scores again for appropriateness and expertise, low scores for transparency, reliability, and trust. Now, in our experiment, I mentioned that for half the sample, we asked the Gallup question about trust in government at the beginning of the survey. And for the other half, we asked the question near the end of the survey. Our hypothesis was that after thinking through the details of what the government does in these 5 different policy areas, people would have significantly more trust in the federal government. And while we see a slight effect in this direction, the difference was not statistically significant. So our conclusion then, we find that overall trust seems to be most closely related to transparency and reliability. Although many people expressed support for the appropriateness of government involvement and for the government's expertise in these 5 policy areas, they were less willing to agree that the federal government is transparent, what it does, and is reliable when it comes to getting results. That in turn led to lower level of trusts. We also found no evidence of a priming effect of thinking through the details of what the federal government does on the general measure of trust. So it seems that these results point less to a crisis for democracy and more towards what we might call a customer service problem related to people's perception of government performance. Thank you.